Good morning, everyone. Sorry for the delays. Okay. So just to summarize where we were up to, I'll just say very briefly several points. The first year, I spent some time explaining that the debate around modern political Zionism is not directly linked to some of the fascinating classic debates that took place already in the era of the Rishonim, and really perhaps in the era of the Tanoim and Amoraim, as to the halachic responsibility of Jews to settle the lands of Israel and conquer it. So these are, in essence, two separate topics. There's a little bit of a Venn diagram that we will explore this year between the two, but the overlap between the two topics is remarkably limited. In other words, very few of the religious responses to political Zionism took as their direct sources the classic debates around the Mitzvahs of Yishuv Eretz Yisrael and Kivush Eretz Yisrael. And in principle, you can hold either stance in terms of Yishuv and Kivush, the mitzvahs, the halachic aspects of the mitzvah and obligation to settle the lands of Israel or conquer it, and the sort of Hashkafic or halachic response to political Zionism. So that was the first point I made. The second point I made was that ostensibly an approach of rabbinic neutrality could have also been a reasonable response to political Zionism. Maybe it's a political problem with a political solution. It's a socio-economic and political theory of a solution to anti-Semitism and the rights of Jews to a national homeland, and a response to the rise of nationalism in 19th century Europe. And it doesn't need to be something to which there's any rabbinic response at all. And we discussed, as you mentioned, the divide between the king, the divide between the Melech, the king, and the Sanhedrin, and one would have thought that there need not necessarily be a rabbinic response to this at all. Though, as we will see, that obviously that was not the case, and there were significant rabbinic responses. The third point I made is that for now we were going with a very simple definition of political Zionism, which is a political right for Jews as any other nation to have their own national state and homeland. And the reason I mention that is first because if we're talking about Zionism, we need a sort of basic definition, and the exact definition is complicated with numerous schools of thought. But for the purposes of a religious response, this is for now accurate enough. But the second reason I mention it is so that we don't confuse the stance of religious anti-Zionism with political anti-Zionism. Political anti-Zionism is largely considered to be a form of anti-Semitism, because the idea that for political reasons Jews are different to other nations and don't have the right to their own state is an anti-Semitic stance. Religious anti-Zionism is not in and of in itself the same. Religious anti-Zionism simply says there are religious reasons why we don't adopt a Zionist stance, as opposed to political reasons. And again, it's just important to make that distinction, particularly because the media sometimes likes blurring the boundaries, and because perhaps the most extreme fringe elements of religious anti-Zionism and Torah and the like sometimes rub shoulders with those very different motives in opposing anti-Zionism. So it's important to, for the purposes of this discussion, distinguish between the two. Someone asked me off group why I spent so long belaboring all these points and basically spent two shiurim talking about them. And it's a fair point, because I did spend quite a long time discussing these points, and I think there's a number of reasons why this is so. The first is because I think it's a subject that has a lot of heat around it and little light, and these points are often confused. The second reason is because I'm talking about something that has links to anti-Semitism, and perhaps therefore I'm a little nervous around the subject. The third reason is because this, as I said, this is a very fraught topic, very strongly held views on either side. Also because it's the most contemporary topic we look at when we're talking about the debates between the Rambam, the rationalists, school of thought of the Rambam, and the Kabbalists. We all may have our own personal views, but no one expects this to be something where a communal rabbi in the 21st century sort of adopts a strong stance either way. And it's understood these are interesting topics in Torah, which we navigate our own avodas Hashem and our own spiritual relationship to Judaism, but not that these are topics where we're sort of currently in the middle of the debate. And more than that, this is a subject that in the Jewish world hasn't yet reached closure. So I think if we were to discuss the arguments between the Vilna Gaon and the Baal Shem Tov, we would legitimately have our own sort of perspectives around how we relate to our own Jewish journey, but we wouldn't be expected. It's an area where closure has been reached. very few people expect us now to take stances in this debate, and we understand, Elu ve'elu divrei Chaim. These are both expressions of different modes of relationship to Judaism. Whereas when it comes to religious anti and pro-Zionism, these are still very, very, very divisive issues, and the religious world has certainly not yet reached closure around this topic. So that's a lengthy apology if I've spent too long belaboring some of these points. Having said all that, what else? What can we say about this? So as I said, there was a rabbinic response, which one might have expected, that rabbinic neutrality and taking no stance at all. However, there were a series of other responses in which it was felt that Torah and Hashkafic and halacha should have important things to say around Zionism. And I'm going to, for the sake of convenience, present this in an ahistoric view, meaning I'm not a perspective. In other words, I'm not going to go in the order in which these different opinions were voiced, but rather try and, as of today, outline what I think are the four main sort of stances to Zionism from a religious perspective. And I want to start off from I think the two extremes, and then walk towards the middle. And I'm not equating the two extremes when I look at them. I'm not saying they are each equally extreme. I'm simply saying they represent the two extremes of thought that are found. And one approach, one extreme of the approach is that most closely associated with the figure of the Satmar Rabbi, or the Satmar Rav. He was the founder of the Hasidic dynasty in Satmar. He was the heir to earlier generations of Hasidic rabbis, but he was the first one who sort of took the title of his dynasty and associated with the community in Hungary of Satmar. Before I say anything else, I should say he was a world-class Gaon. I mean, he was recognized as a Torah scholar on the first order, and he made many contributions to Jewish thought in many different areas. But in the non-Satmar world, he's become most closely associated with ideology of very strong anti-Zionism. Now, I mention this as ahistoric because, of course, he's a fairly late figure in terms of the responses to religious Zionism. He emerged from a cultural milieu that had been anti-Zionist. So there had been very strong trends of anti-Zionism in Hungarian, in his parts of Hungarian Jewry, Nonetheless, he was, to the best of my knowledge, the first sort of consistently formulated, sort of philosophically based expression of this very strong trend of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism that was found in that area, in that region. So I'll label the view of the Satmar Rebbe when we talk about a very strong ideology of anti-Zionism. Now, as a matter of historic interest, it is probably correct to say that the initial impetus for the very strong anti-Zionism in that part of the world was because of a generally very, very strong resistance to modernism. Hungary had become, in that particular era, the battle lines, different times in history, the battle lines, the confrontation between the sort of the forces of modernity and the forces of tradition, if you want to call them that, were in different parts, different regions of the Jewish world. And then had the battle lines had shifted. Hungary at the time was a very fraught area with significant confrontation between two opposing camps. And therefore, the Hungarian part of the Hungarian Jewish leadership had taken up a very strong anti-modernity stance. And the initial response to Zionism, extreme anti-Zionism in that area, was probably driven as part of that sort of general cultural atmosphere. I'm less interested in that, meaning in the context of this year, I'm not interested in those who just say, well, we don't like Zionism because it's being driven by, at the time in the founding stages, by some secular Jews, by some Jews who are influenced by modernity. It's less interesting philosophically in terms of the ongoing look at the religious response to Zionism. And therefore, for now, I'm just going to look at what was said rather than sort of trying to contextualize it and understand where what it might have been in response to. Yes, sorry. Yes. No, the long post. He's a late figure. He's a figure that spans the world wars. So he, So he's a figure that we're talking about that rises to prominence in Satmar pre the Second World War, and then post the Second World War, very successfully rebuilds his Hasidus. Satmar itself, he is not the sole Rav of Satmar. He takes the title of Satmar Rav and later is known as Satmar Rebbe. He's not the sole Rav of Satmar. Satmar itself has a number of communities, including a traditional but not classically religious community. It has a Zionist community. It's like any other community that you would expect to find in Hungary, in that region. They call themselves Hungarian Jews, but they're politically Romanian. Yes, yeah. And we're not going to go into the borders, the ever-shifting borders of Europe. So this is the, and you're right when you mention the figure of the Chasam Sofer, in the sense that yes, the Chasam Sofer is the towering giant of Hungarian and Romanian Jewry who set the tone, as understood by a large, though not all, his followers, that of sort of resistance towards modernity. Chasam Sofer, even the Chasam Sofer, not all his students take that stance, and Chasam Sofer himself has a great grandson known as the Dor Revi, who's an important figure who doesn't take the stance. But yes, the Chasam Sofer is the one associated with that very strong traditionalist fear of modernity. Of course, the famous catchphrase of the Chasam Sofer, Chodash Asa min Torah, punning a halachic expression to give a Hashkafic viewpoint that new ideas are forbidden. Min Torah. So the Satmar Rebbe is definitely sort of part of that atmosphere, but he formulates a very significant philosophy of anti-Zionism, which in its fullest expression doesn't just see anti-Zionism as another ism, as another form of secularism or communism or Bundism or socialism or nationalism and all the isms that are floating around at the time, but sees it as an expression of sheer evil and avodah zarah, and it's the sitra achra, it's the forces of evil in the world, a very, very strong expression of terrible things. And we're going to have to understand, at least briefly, what he's trying to explain, what he's trying to teach with that viewpoint. The opposite extreme, which again, and I stress, I'm not trying in this formulation to indicate that the two extremes are equal, but just for the purposes of clarity, the opposite extreme, the most strongly held pro-religious Zionist stance, is probably that found expression through the writings of Rav Kook. So if we think about the spectrum of views, on the most extreme anti-Zionism view, we have the figure of the Satmar Rebbe. On the most extreme Zionist view, the formulation of Rav Kook. Now, again, I want to stress from historic point of view, Rav Kook is far and away not the only serious Talmud Chacham and serious leading figure who is pro-Zionist for religious reasons. There's many figures, including Reb Shmuel Moliver, including Rav Reines, and a whole array of figures who are religious leaders who are pro-Zionist. But there's no doubt that Rav Kook is a towering figure across the spectrum, and others, in the same way as any honest observer of Torah knowledge has to acknowledge the Satmar Rebbe as a significant Torah figure, whether one likes or doesn't like his views. Similarly, Rav Kook is universally acknowledged as a towering Torah figure, whether one likes or doesn't like his views. And that's why I'm using him as the figure for the opposite point of view. And again, like the Satmar Rebbe, is the one that most clearly formulates and dedicates a significant part of his life's work to formulating a coherent philosophy of religious Zionism. So that's what I mean when I equate them as sort of parallel figures. And I'm not saying anything more in the comparison than they both represent the two sort of poles of expression and philosophical expression of their viewpoints. Again, like the Satmar Rebbe, it's a pity that he's known mostly or solely outside the range of his students for his writings around Zionism, because a very, very significant figure in numerous other areas, has really interesting things to say about a whole range of Hashkafic issues and halachic issues, very, very serious posek, very serious London, the product of the Volozhin yeshiva, who eventually makes his way to the lands of Israel, becomes the Rav of Yaffa, and eventually the first Ashkenazi chief rabbi of Free State Palestine, of the new Yishuv, and again a towering figure universally regarded as such, even by his opponents by and large, in the Torah world. And he takes the stance that Zionism is not just a mitzvah, it's not just something positive, but it is fundamentally the movement that will usher in the era of Mashiach, and it will be the founding blocks, the foundation of the future Messianic state, the future Messianic era. So these are two very strong rabbinic responses to Zionism. And then in the middle, just in the interest of completion, even though we'll need to unpick each of them one by one, you have what I would label the mainstream Aguda approach, which is lukewarm or moderate anti-Zionist, and then you will have what we'll label perhaps the Rav Soloveitchik approach or the American Mizrahi approach and the like, which we'll label as pro-Zionist, but again, a weaker pro-Zionism. So if we have on the two extremes, we have very, very strong religious Zionism from Rav Kook, very strong and radical anti-Zionism from the Satmar Rebbe. You have what we will call moderate anti-Zionism, perhaps from the Agudah, and moderate pro-Zionism from perhaps the modern Orthodox world, primarily in its modern form, primarily in America, though emerging trends in amongst Israeli Zionists also. So that's what I'm picking 4 arbitrary points on what's a very, very complicated spectrum, just for the sake of completion. And there is some still lingering tradition of Zionism, of neutrality towards Zionism from a halachic point of view, in the Brisker tradition, for example, in which by and large their sense is that the apparatus of the modern state of Israel is halachically neutral. It's not something that halacha should expect to comment on at all. It's just apparatus of a state that we need to learn to adapt to and live to and so on. But I'm not going to belabor that point since we've spoken about it at length. So where did the Satmar Rebbe come from, and what was if we unpick the views one by one, what was his primary expression of his viewpoint? So most famously, he adopted a piece of Agadic Gemara, a piece of Midrashic Gemara that is important. It's a piece of Gemara, but not one that would necessarily have been understood as a halachic stance. It's just a piece of medrash that normally is understood to be giving us a piece of hashkafa or worldview, rather than a technically halachic point of view. And he cited this and felt this was very, very significant and important in formulating a response. And this is the famous Gemara in Ksuvas, Kuf Yud Aleph, of the Sholosh Shavuos, the 3 oaths. So this is in Kuf Yud Aleph onwards. Aleph. He also cited to a lesser degree a less famous Gemara, but part of the same piece in the same sugya then Ksuvas, the same topic in Ksuvas, Daf Kuf Yud on the base, which also speaks about this topic. But for now, I'll focus on the famous Sholosh Shavuos. And he was not the first to cite it. Others had cited it before and raised it, but he was the first to sort of build it into a plank stone of a theological response. And the Gemara says that based on psukim in Shir HaShirim, which we read on the Megillah Shir HaShirim that we read on Pesach, Shir HaShirim is an extended metaphor of love between Benois Yerushalayim, between an individual lady and her lover, between the daughters of Jerusalem and her lover, understood in allegory to be a metaphor of the relationship between the Jewish people and Hashem. And it has 3 players really. It has the woman, the lover, the woman and her lover, and a voice of seduction, a stranger who attempts to seduce and persecute alternately. And these are understood to be a metaphor for the Jewish people, for Hashem, and for the nations of the world. And Shir HaShirim discusses this very messy 3-way relationship and this sort of ongoing tension between these 3 players. And if you look at the conversation that takes place between them, it's this horrible and tragic 3-way relationship in which Lanus, you're going to struggle with that without getting Danny or someone else to do it. It's just it's this uneasy 3-way relationship in which the Jewish people, in the figure of the lady, get tempted away from their lover, move back. At the time when they approach the lover, there's a distance between them, and a complex triangle of relationships. Amongst the events that occur in Shir HaShirim are 3 times an expression of a shavua. Nishbati eschem b'nois Yerushalayim, I make you promise, O daughters of Yerushalayim. And the Gemara in Ksuvas analyzes these psukim to say that there are 3 shavuos, 3 expressions made. One in which Hashem makes Hashem makes the nations of the world promise not to overly persecute the Jewish people, and one in which the Jewish people, or two in which the Jewish people are made to make a promise not to rebel against the nations of the world and not to go up en masse to Eretz Yisrael. So this is what the Gemara says. The Gemara understands Shir HaShirim to be saying that we are sworn not to rebel against our condition of exile, our condition of Golus, and not to go up en masse to the land of Israel. In other words, to accept that when we are in Golus, we are in Golus. When we're in exile, we're in exile, and we have to live with that until Hashem decides to return us. This is the Gemara in Kesuvos, as stressed by the Satmar Rebbe. Now, around this point of the Satmar Rebbe, both after he raised it and before he raised it, were a number of technical questions. Technical question number one is, to what degree can a Gemara, which is a medrash, it's an agadic Gemara interpreting Pesukim in Shir HaShirim, be taken as a practical source for halachic life? Maybe it's telling us something about what Golus is, who took this Shavua? When did we ever make this oath? Which representative of the Jewish people agreed to it? You know, we talk about a covenant at Har Sinai. So our tradition tells us that this covenant was indeed a covenant entered into by parties. We stood at Har Sinai, we said Nasa Nishma. There was a national covenant. There was a national covenant at Aros Moav, the plains of Moav. So we understand that there's a genuine place. There were covenants that the Jewish people entered into as represented by the founders of the Jewish people, Avram and so on and so forth. Who entered into this covenant over here? When was this covenant made? You know, was it a prophetic covenant that the Jews accepted at some mass gathering, like the return of the second Beis HaMikdash, when Ezra gathered the Jewish people and bestirred them back to a renewed relationship to Hashem? Where does this idea, when was this covenant halachically entered into? And therefore, does the Gemara really mean this as a technical shavua by which the Jewish people are bound? Or is it an expression of theology of what the essence of Golus is? That Golus is an uneasy relationship, and Shir HaShirim is an uneasy relationship between the nations of the world who are meant to, in this theological expression, have repress us somewhat, but not overly repress us. And how are we meant to understand this whole sort of dynamic that's going on? That's going on over here in the Gemara. Is it indeed a technical halachic expression of fact? So this is one question that's asked against the Satmar Rebbe. Where do we paskin from? Where do we find that we use our Goda to paskin from in this way? We discussed many years ago, several years ago in our Sunday morning series, even the Ikrim, the 13 fundamentals of the faith, which the Rambam derives somewhat from Agada. Lots of discussion about to what degree this can enter into halachic literature. But here, this is an Agada that no one has cited as halachic before. You can't open a page of Rambam or Shulchan Aruch and find this Gemara in Kesuvos quoted as a sif in Shulchan Aruch: "Thou shalt not rebel against the nations of the world. Don't go up en masse to Eretz Yisrael." And indeed, what's the halachic parameters of this, if this is indeed the case? How much is en masse? I mean, we know that Jews went up in significant numbers to the land of Israel, great figures throughout the generations. The Bali Tosfos under the Rosh Mishant went up to Eretz Yisrael, 300 of them. The Rabbi Yosef Cairo and the exiles from Spain went there, and there was a large and significant yishuv. So at what point is the critical number of en masse Aliya to Israel that becomes problematic? Are we talking about thousands or several thousands or a million? This isn't worked out like any normal halachic sugya that you would expect to be found through the generations. So this was one sort of response. A second sort of response was, in practice, is this the minhag that we find? Do we find that this is how Jews behaved? And a third sort of response was, well, maybe this is no longer a rebellion against the nations of the world, since the nations of the world have granted us a right to a homeland through the Balfour Declaration. So again, halachic ink spilt, even if you take this argument seriously. Maybe this isn't a rebellion against the nations, since at the time, the most powerful empire in the world, the British Empire, has accepted the right of Jews. To some degree or other, it's expressed by the right of self-determination in the post-World War Woodrow Wilson's points. It's a nation, when it is founded, recognized by the UN, despite the UN not being the best friends of the state of Israel, but still a nation amongst nations. It's recognized. In what way? Who are these nations of the world in which we are rebelling by setting up the state of Israel, when the nations of the world have accepted the existence of the state of Israel, albeit somewhat with discomfort? So these are various points that are made in response. In addition, have the nations of the world kept their side of the promise? So if there's a three-way covenant over here in which the nations of the world have been promised, committed not to overly persecute us, well, the Crusades, the Nazi massacres, the Holocaust, have they kept their side of the promise? And how does that affect our commitment in return when we're just engaged in an act of self-defense against what had become a completely unbearable exile experience? If you could argue it's bearable and moderate, perhaps in Talmudic times under the Babylonian rulers, can we really look at the course of Jewish history and say that this is in remotely what humans are expected to bear and not take into their hands a response? So these were some of the replies that were given to the Satmar Rebbe. In brief, Satmar Rebbe mentions, and others had too, for the sake of historic accuracy, others had to taken this Gemara and Ksuvas, the three oaths, as the plank of his theology. Is it a halachic source at all? How do we define the halachas? What's called Aliya on Nas? At what point is this in line with the minhag? Is this indeed halachically relevant anymore, post-UN and League of Nations views, post-British mandates, etc.? And finally, do we need to keep our sides of the promise if the nations of the world, I think we could all agree, have broken their side of the promise in turn? There are, by the way, and I want to mention this again for the sake of accuracy, there are serious figures like the Hashkafic who do engage with this argument of the Satmar Rebbe and responds with things like the Balfour Declaration, countermands it. So it's not an argument that is sort of ignored by pre-Second World War Jewry. It is something taken somewhat seriously. As I said, not just the Satmar Rebbe that puts forward this argument of the Shalosh Shavuos, it's others also.
The Satmar Rebbe in his tshuva put the other side of the coin there and then work through it and dismiss it.
So the Satmar Rebbe in his V'yol Moshe, it's not just a shuvah, it's a book. It's a book. It's a whole book, and it's an encyclopedic book. There are Dati Leumi yeshivas to this day in the state of Israel that learn chunks of it because it is an encyclopedic work. And again, I just want to stress, I mean, when you look at it, you see the vast command, the sovereign command that the Satmar Rebbe had of Jewish sources. He's a significant figure. He's not a figure that can be lightly dismissed in terms of status as a Talmud Chacham. This is not meant as a loaded comment, but not every Hasidic Rebbe is a first order figure beyond their Hasidus, and nor do they deserve to be so. The Satmar Rebbe is a significant figure, and he's also, again, one of the rebuilders of post-World War Jewry. As a survivor of the World War, of the Holocaust, he turns up on the shores of America. He's very, I should mention that I'm not going to go into now, he's a controversial figure on other levels also, what happened during the war years and how he rebuilt his Hasidus. A very, very interesting figure, and a figure of stark contradictions, a very, very stern and tough figure with with in many respects an angry demeanor. He's also an exceptionally loving figure with a warm embrace of all Jews on a personal level. It's probably a topic for its own right, just to, one could spend hours talking about a very, very complex character. But there's no doubt he's one of the primary architects of the resurgence of Jews post-war. And again, one can't get away from that historic fact that he builds a Hasidus which is massive, and beyond the impact of his own Hasidus, is one of the architects of a rebuilt and resurgent and confident Orthodox Jewry post the Holocaust. So a big figure and a giant of a man, whether one agrees or disagrees with what he says on this. So this is the Satmar Rebbe's expression of theology. By the way, just an entrance of accuracy, the Rambam in his Igeres Teiman, in his famous letter to the Jews of Yemen. So the background to this is that the Jews of Yemen are facing terrible persecution by a fundamentalist Muslim sect, going back to the life of the Rambam, time of the Rambam. In addition, they're weakened because of a Mashiach Sheker, a false Messiah episode, which always leaves Jewry reeling. They write a letter to Egypt, to two figures. They write a letter to the Egyptian military leader, at the time a rising star, who would eventually become known as Saladin to the west, as the powerful Egyptian ruler, and who responds, by the way, and does send a force to Yemen to repress the Muslim extremists there under the generalship of his brother. Whether triggered by the request and appeal of the Jews of Yemen or not, we don't know. But he does eventually send a military force that puts down the fundamentalist Muslim rulers of Yemen. And they also write to the Rambam, who was the Jewish leader at the time, and the Rambam responds with a letter of incredible halacha and Torah and pastoral love and care, in which he really gives chizuk and encouragement to the Jews of Yemen. And there he does reference this Gemara of Shalosh Shavuos. So you said does the Satmar Rebbe respond? So I'm adding this in, I wasn't planning to mention this. This is one example of response, in which the Satmar Rebbe says, look, you do see that a halachic figure like the Rambam does mention this source, because the Rambam brings this Gemara and he says to the Jews of Yemen, Golus is tough, it's unbearable, it's really horrible. But you should know this Gemara in Kesufos explains what's our relationship. We need to sometimes just put our heads down and bear it and get on with it, and cope with it. So you do have a halachic figure like the Rambam bringing this Gemara. On the other hand, the Rambam doesn't mention it in his Mishpat Torah, in his great halachic work. So a letter written by the Rambam as a word of encouragement to Jews struggling under Golus, in which he espouses a theology of Shalosh Shavuos and put your head down and bear it, may be a very wise letter to write to the Jews of Yemen. But if it's not brought in Mishnah Torah, it's difficult to take it as sort of conclusive of the Rambam's works. The Rambam, by the way, did write letters in which he gave halachic views. Because Taiman is a letter of encouragement. It's scarcely a sort of classic source of halacha.
Of course, is very interesting, isn't it?
So the Geras Hashmad, the background to the Geras Hashmad, also a fascinating letter, is a letter written as encouragement to a Jew who had under force converted to Islam, had then returned to practicing Judaism when he had met. Again, the Rambam himself was a refugee from fundamental. We speak about the golden age of Jews under Muslim rule. It's important to be aware that, like all other faiths and religions and cultures and so on, it went through waves. And the Rambam, born in Spain, had to run away from Spain and then run away from North Africa and eventually go to Egypt because of waves of fundamentalist Islam that took over Spain and North Africa. And there were Jews who were forcibly converted. This particular Jew was in North Africa who was forcibly converted, then returned to practicing Judaism and faced critics who questioned his right to be a Jew in good standing in the Jewish community. And the Rambam wrote a remarkable letter of pastoral warmth and love and care, in which he discusses the halachas of forcible conversion, and again gives this person encouragement in their return to Judaism and becoming a Baal Teshuvah. So again, a parallel. You see a different side of the Rambam in these letters, but whether one can draw halachic conclusions from these letters, especially when it's something not mentioned at all in Mishnah Torah, is difficult. Now, so that's one example of the Satmar Rebbe response. Someone has written on this course, is it correct that Satmar Rebbe gave a reason for the Holocaust, the Jews breaking of the oaths? That is correct. There are indications Satmar Rebbe around this. For obvious reasons, I don't really want to go into this side of things. And the whole sort of domain of reasons for the Holocaust is one that's I just want to touch on now, because it's beyond sensitive and it's beyond my expertise, and it would need a series in its own right. In general, I think it's obvious to all of us that engaging in this sort of discussion around theological reasons for the Holocaust is beyond unacceptable. So this is the view of the Satmar Rebbe. Now, what I think is often missed around this discussion is that the Satmar Rebbe was using this Agadic source really to say something beyond this, and he writes about this again. Leonard does. He writes about this again extensively. The Satmar Rebbe isn't just saying there's a shavua, there's a promise that's been made, and therefore we need to keep it. What he is saying is, and this is where it behooves all of us to pay serious attention to his arguments, because he's onto something here, and there's something we need to hear of what he says. Maybe I want to just backtrack from that phrase. The Satmar Rebbe is a great figure, and for me to sit here saying he's onto something is almost an act of disrespect. I don't mean it like that. I'm simply trying to share his perspective. But for those of us that really, really, very fundamentally and deeply do not align ourselves with his viewpoint, nonetheless, he deserves to be heard, and there's something that we do need to hear it. And he has a concern, which is really what's motivating him here, and a concern that we need to ponder about what it means to set up a Jewish state in a pre-Messianic era, and how can such a Jewish state work. And he was one of the earliest figures to sort of note some of the intrinsic paradoxes with which we are still struggling to this day about what a Jewish state means. And in his view, these paradoxes were so problematic and difficult, they were irresolvable. And therefore, he said, these are things that need to wait for the coming of Moshiach. And there's legitimacy to that problem, to that expression. There's a question that needs to be asked. What does it mean to have a Jewish state in a world in which a majority of Jews by then are non-halachic? How is this going to affect how we define, or non-practicing halachic, or not practicing halacha, I'm sorry, yeah, or not practicing halacha? How is this going to affect what we mean by Jewish identity? In what way is this a Jewish state when it's not going to be a state run by Torah law? How can a Jewish state and a democratic state, how can those two phrases go together when a Jewish democratic state? What is going to be the place of non-Jewish citizens in a Jewish state? Very, very fundamental questions about what it means to be a Jewish state. And is this going to, out of this, will there emerge a new definition of what it means to be a Jew? What is a Jew? Are we a culture, an ethnicity, a religion, a race? The famous classic questions, right? They've just hit the media now, most recently, with these comments about, the Holocaust, an act of racism or something else. And we've torn ourselves apart since the onset of modernity, when people began thinking in these terms about what is the definition of all of these things and how do we operate as a Jewish people. And we continue to tear ourselves apart around these things, right? Look at the debates going on now in the lands of Israel around the Kosel Plaza and how it should be allocated to participants, around the rules of Geirus, the laws of marriage in Israel. On the one hand, how can we as Jews passionate about halachic Jewish identity not have a rabbanut which clarifies who is halachic Jewish and who isn't, and supervises halachic marriage and others? And on the other hand, how is it tenable in that we have a modern state in which Jews simply can't get married to each other because it's a non-halachic marriage? These are like fundamental problems over what it means to be a Jew in the 21st century, brought to fullest expression by the apparatus of a Jewish state. So in Chutz La'aretz, we resolve these questions because we don't need to confront them. So none of us have an issue with a Beis-Din, which is a purely halachic authority, overseeing purely halachic marriages and purely halachic divorces and purely halachic determinations of Jewish identity and geirus and everything else, because we voluntarily opt into a club, basically, the club of a shul and the club of a gathering of shuls which form into a United Synagogue or Federation or a union or whatever it may be, and the club can set its own rules, and we're able to operate like that, and therefore by and large we can get on with Jews who are members of other clubs, and we can live with them, and it doesn't end up as a formative definition. But when you have a state, when you have the operational state, what does it look like? And in essence, the Satmar Rebbe was arguing, we're not yet ready to have a state. Again, I want to stress, everyone agrees halachically that Torah needs to be expressed as I mentioned in my first year, as a chovas yochid, as a personal obligation, as a chovas tzibur, as a communal obligation, like a minyan, as a town or city-wide obligation. We have a city-wide obligation to ensure that Jewish schools and mikvahs and shuls and the like. And then there's a national existence of Jews. That's not a controversial point. Some isn't against the idea of Jews having being a nation which has a national expression of halacha. They know that there's halachas around appointments of a Jewish government, a king, of the Sanhedrin, of the court system. They simply say that until we enter into a utopian world, a world of Mashiach, in which we have a Jewish leader who is genuinely capable of inspiring the whole Jewish people and ultimately the whole world back to correct identification with halacha and halachic practice, until that point we're simply not capable of making a state, and making a state is by definition going to bring out irresolvable dilemmas in Jewish identity, and irresolvable dilemmas more profoundly than what is a Jew. Where are we heading with this? And again, there are phrases in some of the early secular Zionist leaders which feed into the Satmar Rebbe's fear, in which they say that the true Jew will be the citizen of now new Jewish state of Israel, because that's what it will mean to be a Jew again. To be a Jew again will be to be a citizen of the Jewish state. And that someone who is halachically non-Jewish but a citizen of the Jewish state is somehow more Jewish than someone who's halachically Jewish but choosing to live in Chutz La'aretz. So this is a redefinition of Jews and Judaism. Is Judaism being redefined? And again, there are writings about this in earlier secular Zionism. Is Judaism now being redefined as a nation amongst the nations, in which, like you are French and English and German, you're Jewish, and it's being removed and wrenched away from its role as had been understood traditionally in the view of the Satmar Rebbe until then, as a religion and a faith and as identification with HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Satmar Rebbe doesn't just see the Shalosh Shavuos as this mysterious Agadah or Medrash in which we're forced to make promises. He sees it as sort of telling us something fundamental about the Golus existence, what it means to be in Golus, what it means to be in exile, what it means to be in a pre-Messianic age, is we're unable to know how to form a Jewish state. And if we attempt to do so, we will end up with irresolvable dilemmas. Again, dilemmas we live with to this day. What is the relationship between diaspora Jews and the state of Israel? Should we have a voice in the affairs of the state of Israel? Or no, we choose not to live there, so we are not entitled to a voice, but it's the Jewish state. It does represent us. Does it represent us, or does it not represent Jews in the diaspora? Discussions around with COVID. Was it right of Israel to say that Michal Cohen, who's an Israeli citizen and lives in Australia, is allowed into Israel during COVID, and Michal Cohen, who is not an Israeli citizen, isn't allowed? American Jewry now up in arms about what this has said about its relationship to Israel and its ability to go there. So very fundamental questions that continue to reverberate in Jewish conversation to this day, identified by the Satmar Rebbe as being why he thinks we are unable to form a Jewish state in this era, and the fear and the terror that Satmar Rebbe feels is that if this project gets off the ground, and if it succeeds and if it flourishes, it will end up redefining what a Jew is. It will redefine a Jew as a citizen, a passport holder of a secular-run state, and that will be a catastrophe. That's something that we have to fight tooth and nail as an exceptionally dangerous. And therefore, he says, everything that is linked to Zionism is avodah zarah. It's one of the shalosh chamuras. It's like a cardinal sin. This is what he says. It's equivalent to cardinal sin because this is worshipping the idolatry of a new defining Aliya Yisrael, like this week's section, Parshas Kisisa. These are your gods, O Israel. The cry that was put out by the Egel builders, the golden calf builders, is what's going on now. And he says, this is terrible. I'm seeing deeply faithful religious Jews crying, Aliya Yisrael, these are your gods, O Israel, rebuilding this secular God of Zionism. This is something untenable that I need to fight over. Now, I'm conscious that we're coming to the end of the time, and in a sense, I'm going to have to finish this series with the Satmar Rebbe. So I want to stress, I was last week asked by someone off group in my speaking at length about the idea that you could argue that Zionism is a neutral point, and rabbis shouldn't have any views on the matter. Was I expressing my own personal opinion? I was simply sharing a perspective, and one that in many ways should be the default perspective as we approach this topic. I want to stress again, despite a passionate attempt at presenting the views of the Satmar Rebbe, these are not my own personal views, if I need to make that clear. I'm simply presenting with respect towards a man who, however radically one disagrees with his views, and some of them are really, really disturbing. I alluded to some of them because I was asked around the Holocaust and other such things. People are not black and white, and we need to recognize this as a figure that is part of Jewish history, whatever our views on the matter is, and therefore I try to present his views with the respect they deserve. In the next year, I would like to present how his views have had to be adapted by his followers till 2022, and why I believe that the current iteration of his views in their current expression deserve no respect whatsoever and should not be taken seriously, because don't forget, time has moved on, and what was legitimate debate 100 years ago, 80 years ago, I think things have shifted, and I will try and share why I think the current iteration of Satmar views is deeply, deeply problematic and should be deeply problematic for us. And I will not attempt to present that angle with respect. But the initial rounds and the salvo of the cannonballs shot out by a great weapon, the Satmar Rebbe, they deserve to be understood, even if we're now going to have to explore what might be a response to them. So I'll finish with that for today. And please go next week, we will look at round 2 of the Satmar perspective as of the year 2022 and where that's perhaps all gone wrong. And I'll stop here for today.